The morning haze hung low across the jagged ridges, casting long shadows over the forward operating base, and Lieutenant Commander Hayes adjusted her binoculars, scanning the distant peaks for any sign of the damaged A-10 the SEALs crouched behind. Rock's rifles ready, every muscle taut with anticipation, because the mission had already stretched beyond expectation, and the silence pressing against them was heavier than any gunfire they had faced before, leaving every sense on high alert. Smoke drifted across the valley from previous skirmishes, thick and acrid, curling around the rocks and making the world appear distorted and unreal, and Hayes felt her pulse quicken as she tried to pierce the haze for any glimpse of the approaching aircraft. And the SEALs tensed behind her, knowing that the plane had been hit in the initial assault, and every second that passed without a sight of it increased the tension, because the ridge offered no forgiveness for mistakes, and the next moment could bring either salvation or disaster. A faint glint of metal appeared through the smoke, a small shimmering point that resolved into the shape of the A-10 struggling to maintain altitude, and Hayes felt her stomach tighten as the engine screamed, the fuselage battered, panels torn, and smoke trailing behind in a ghostly ribbon that marked the path of damage, and the SEALs held their breath, frozen in place, watching a machine that should have been grounded claw its way through the haze with a stubborn defiance that made every heart pound, leaving them suspended in awe and fear. The engines roared a guttural scream against the quiet of the ridge, shaking the air with raw power and desperation, and Hayes pressed herself lower instinctively, feeling the vibration through the rocks and into her bones, and she could see the pilot struggling against every gust of wind, every uneven current coaxing life from a machine that seemed on the verge of collapse. And the SEALs exchanged tense glances, knowing that one miscalculation could turn miraculous survival into instant catastrophe, leaving the next second charged with suspense. Sparks flickered along the torn panels of the A-10 as it banked precariously to avoid a jagged cliff, the fuselage groaning under stress, and Hayes felt a shiver run down her spine, because this was no longer just a flight, it was a battle of endurance and skill, and every adjustment the pilot made was a negotiation with gravity and damage. And the SEALs watched rigidly, knowing that the ridge offered no mercy, and the next moment could claim the aircraft, leaving them poised on the edge of fear. And a weathy ridge narrowed, forcing the A-10 to twist dangerously as it approached the final stretch, and Hayes felt her chest tighten, realizing the pilot had no margin for error, no room for hesitation. And the SEALs mirrored her tension, their eyes locked on the battered fuselage as it wobbled inch by inch across the treacherous terrain, and sparks erupted from the engines, trailing faintly into the smoke as if marking the pulse of survival. And the next moment seemed impossibly critical. A sudden flare erupted from the exhaust, a brief orange flash that illuminated the torn metal, and Hayes could feel the heat brush her face, a reminder of the fragile line between life and destruction. And she watched the pilot's hands move rapidly across the controls, each twitch precise, coaxing stability from chaos. And the SEALs remained frozen, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide, knowing that the aircraft's path was a razor edge between salvation and catastrophe, and the next movement could decide everything. The smoke thickened as the aircraft pushed forward, a ghostly veil that distorted the view of the landing zone, and Hayes felt the tension press down on her shoulders, a weight that seemed to mirror the strain on the A-10 itself. And she saw the pilot lean into the controls, adjusting every minute detail as the engine screamed and groaned under pressure, and the SEALs gripped their weapons tighter, knowing that the slightest miscalculation could send the machine tumbling into jagged rocks, leaving them suspended in a moment that stretched endlessly forward. The engines howled again, a high-pitched note that vibrated through the ridge, and Hayes felt the pulse echo in her chest as the fuselage shuddered with the force of wind, damage, and exhaustion, and she could see sparks trailing faintly along the torn panels, marking the heartbeat of a machine that refused to yield. And the SEALs watched in silence, frozen in awe, as the aircraft inched forward, a wounded but unbroken survivor, defying every expectation, and the next second could decide whether it lived or fell. A small Rock tumbled from the ridge above, and the A-10 twisted sharply to avoid it, the fuselage groaning as the metal flexed under strain, and Hayes instinctively ducked lower, gripping the edge of the rocks, feeling every vibration as if the struggle of the aircraft was reflected in her own body, and the seals shifted slightly, ready to react to any failure yet powerless to prevent it, and she realized that the next instant held the weight of life and death, leaving suspense thick in the earth. Fuel hissed faintly behind the engines, igniting small flickers along the fuselage, and Hayes could feel the heat on her face, a reminder of the danger that clung to every inch of the aircraft, and she watched as the pilot made micro-adjustments, each one a delicate negotiation with physics itself, and the SEALs remained frozen, their eyes locked on the plane, knowing that every second now carried the weight of life and death, and the next instant could tip the balance in favor of survival or catastrophe. The landing zone came into view, a narrow strip of uneven terrain framed by jagged rocks, and Hayes felt her pulse spike as the A-10 wobbled slightly, engines screaming every groan a plea for survival, and she could see the pilot's precision coaxing stability from a machine pushed to its absolute limits, and the SEALs held their positions frozen, knowing that the final stretch would demand perfection, and the next fraction of a second could tip the balance into triumph or disaster, leaving anticipation taut as a Wyeth smoke shifted, catching the sunlight in strange ways, the torn metal reflecting brief glimmers of light, and Hayes felt a surge of fear mixed with awe as the aircraft approached the uneven landing zone, wings flexing under stress, engines roaring, a wounded but determined predator, and the SEALs exchanged tense glances, knowing that the margin for error was microscopic and the next movement could decide whether the aircraft survived or collapsed into destruction, leaving the moment. Suspended sparks flared along the torn panels, every flash a heartbeat in the struggle as the A-10 fought to maintain altitude and balance, and Hayes could feel the tension radiate from the ridge as the pilot leaned into every adjustment, coaxing life from a machine stretched beyond reason, and the SEALs remained frozen, their eyes locked on the aircraft, knowing that the next second could define survival, and the final outcome hung precariously above the jagged terrain, leaving suspense unbroken. The aircraft wavered slightly, engines screaming and groaning as the pilot coaxed stability inch by inch, and Hayes felt her chest tighten with every movement, knowing that the fragile equilibrium could collapse at any instant, and the SEALs mirrored her tension, every breath shallow, every muscle taut as the A-10 inched closer to the landing zone, a wounded survivor defying the odds, and she realized that the next moment held the culmination of every effort. Every instinct and every heartbeat, leaving anticipation taut. A sudden gust of wind rocked the aircraft sideways, sparks trailing along torn panels, and Hayes instinctively pressed herself lower, gripping the ridge, feeling the pulse of the aircraft's struggle in her own bones. The SEALs froze alongside her, knowing that the pilot's endurance was the only barrier between life and disaster, and the next instant could define survival, leaving anticipation taut and electric. The engines screamed a final defiance, the fuselage flexing dangerously as the aircraft hovered just above the landing zone. Hayes could see the trail of smoke curling behind like a ghostly heartbeat of survival, and the SEALs held their collective breath, frozen in as the pilot coaxed the machine forward inch by inch, a wounded survivor refusing to yield, and she realized that the story of endurance and defiance was nearing its climax, and the next instant would reveal whether triumph or disaster prevailed, leaving suspense unbroken. The A-10 hovered precariously above the uneven terrain, engines screaming a guttural roar that shook the ridge. Hayes felt the vibration reverberate through her body, every nerve taut as the SEALs crouched behind jagged rocks, rifles ready but powerless to intervene, and she could see the torn metal trembling in the gusts of wind, every spark flaring like a heartbeat in the battle for survival, and the next instant could tip the scales toward catastrophe or triumph, leaving suspense thick in the Earth fuselage wobbled violently as the pilot leaned into every adjustment, coaxing life from damaged wings and engines groaning under strain, and Hayes felt her pulse race as she imagined the countless calculations and micro-corrections taking place in the cockpit, and the SEALs mirrored her tension, eyes wide, muscles taut, knowing that one misstep would send the aircraft plummeting into jagged rocks, and the next second could decide the fate of every life in the valley. Leaving anticipation. Razor-sharp smoke curled around the landing zone, distorting the view, the torn metal glinting through the haze like a wounded ghost, and Hayes pressed herself closer to the ground, feeling the pulse of the aircraft through the ridge, and she could see the pilot battling fatigue, pain, and gravity. Every twitch of the controls a negotiation with survival, and the SEALs remained frozen, their collective breath held, knowing that the final approach demanded perfection, and the next instant could tip the balance into disaster. Leaving suspense suspended, a flare of fuel ignited along the fuselage, briefly lighting the torn panels in a fiery glow, and Hayes felt a shiver run down her spine, the heat brushing faintly across her face, a warning that one wrong move could ignite catastrophe. And she could see the pilot leaning fully into the controls, coaxing the machine forward, every micro adjustment precise and necessary, and the SEALs gripped their rifles tighter, knowing that the next heartbeat could define survival. Leaving tension thick as steel, ridge narrowed, forcing the A-10 to twist dangerously as it approached the fragile landing strip. Hayes could see the fuselage bending under the stress, the engines screaming as the pilot fought to maintain control, and she felt her stomach tighten, knowing there was no room for error, no margin for hesitation, and the SEALs mirrored her tension, holding their positions frozen, knowing that the slightest miscalculation could end everything in an instant, and the next moment could decide whether the aircraft survived. A small boulder tumbled down from above the ridge, and the aircraft twisted violently to avoid its sparks trailing along the torn panels, and Hayes instinctively ducked lower, gripping the rocks, feeling every vibration as if the struggle of the aircraft coursed through her own body, and the SEALs remained rigid, watching the impossible unfold, knowing that the pilot's skill and endurance were the only things keeping the machine from collapsing, and the next second could tip the balance toward disaster. The engines roared, a guttural scream vibrating across the valley as the A-10 twisted and wobbled, adjusting for uneven terrain and wind. Hayes felt the tension press against her chest, a weight mirrored by the strain on the aircraft, and she realized that this was more than a landing, it was a battle against physics, fate, and damage all at once, and the SEALs held their collective breath, sensing every spark, every groan, every subtle movement, as if the aircraft's struggle were shared by them. Leaving suspense taut, and electric sparks flared along the torn fuselage, each flash a heartbeat marking the fragile line between survival and failure. Hayes could see faint trails of smoke twisting behind the aircraft like ghostly fingers reaching across the ridge, and the SEALs remained frozen, eyes locked on the aircraft, knowing that one misstep could end everything in an instant, and she understood that the pilot's skill had become the only barrier holding life together, and the next second could define survival. The A-10 wavered slightly, engines screaming, the fuselage groaning violently. Hayes felt her pulse synchronize with the rhythm of the aircraft. The SEALs tensed instinctively, every muscle rigid, every breath shallow, and she realized that the pilot's endurance had become a physical presence around them, every spark, every shudder a testament to human will, and the next heartbeat could tip the scale either toward salvation or disaster. Leaving suspense suspended like smoke above the valley, ridge narrowed, forcing the aircraft to twist dangerously. Hayes could see the fuselage bending under stress, and she felt her stomach twist with tension every microsecond, a negotiation with gravity, wind, and damage. The SEALs mirrored her awareness, holding their positions frozen, knowing that the slightest miscalculation could claim the aircraft in an instant, and the A-10 inched forward inch by inch, leaving the outcome hanging impossibly between hope and catastrophe. A sudden flare of fuel ignited along the fuselage, the heat brushing faintly across Hayes's face, a reminder of the fragile line between survival and destruction. She could see the pilot leaning into the controls, coaxing life from metal and fire, every adjustment precise and deliberate, and the SEALs held their collective breath frozen, knowing that the final stretch demanded perfection, and the next moment could tip the scales. Leaving suspense taut and unbearable. Engines howled again, a high-pitched scream reverberating through the ridge as the A-10 adjusted for the uneven terrain, the fuselage trembling violently. Hayes felt the vibration pulse Through her body a physical echo of the aircraft's struggle, the SEALs remained frozen, eyes locked on the plane, knowing that the next second could define survival, and the pilot's skill and endurance had become the only barrier between triumph and disaster. Leaving suspense hanging like smoketh landing strip came into view, a narrow uneven patch framed by jagged rocks. Hayes felt her chest tighten as the aircraft wobbled slightly, engines screaming and groaning, the fuselage bending and flexing under strain, and she could see the subtle micro-adjustments coaxing stability inch by inch, and the SEALs held their positions, tense breaths shallow, knowing that the fragile equilibrium could collapse at any second, and the next heartbeat could tip the balance toward catastrophe. A gust of wind rocked the aircraft, the fuselage trembling violently, sparks trailing along the torn panels, and Hayes instinctively pressed herself lower, gripping the ridge, feeling the pulse of the struggle in her bones. The SEALs mirrored her tension, knowing that the pilot's skill, endurance, and sheer will were the only things keeping the aircraft from disaster, and the next second could tip the balance, leaving anticipation taut and electric. Engines screamed a final defiance, the fuselage flexing dangerously as the aircraft hovered just above the landing strip. Hayes could see the trail of smoke curling behind like a ghostly heartbeat of survival. The SEALs held their collective breath, frozen in awe as the pilot coaxed the machine forward inch by inch, a wounded survivor refusing to yield, and she realized that the story of endurance and defiance was nearing its climax, and the next instant would reveal whether triumph or disaster prevailed. Leaving suspense unbroken, wheels finally touched down lightly, the fuselage shuddering violently, engines screaming as the aircraft stabilized. Hayes exhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders, the sparks and smoke still trailing faintly from the torn panels, and the SEALs exhaled in unison, their bodies relaxing for the first time in hours, and she realized that the impossible had been achieved. The pilot had coaxed life from a machine battered beyond belief, leaving nothing but awe and relief in their wake. The A-10 rested on the fragile landing strip, engines sputtering a low moan of exhaustion. Hayes felt the ridge vibrate with a residual hum of power and tension. The SEALs slowly lowered themselves from their crouches, rifles still ready but eyes glued to the battered aircraft, and she could see the pilot's hands trembling slightly as they moved across the controls, every motion deliberate and precise, a testament to survival, and the next moment could reveal the full scope of what had been accomplished. Leaving suspense lingering like smoketh, fuselage hissed as hot metal cooled, sparks fading slowly into the morning haze. Hayes stepped closer, signaling the SEALs to approach cautiously. The aircraft was fragile, every movement a risk, but the SEALs moved as one unit, their trust in the pilot absolute, and she watched the canopy open, the pilot emerging slowly, sweat and soot streaked across her face, eyes focused yet exhausted, and the SEALs exchanged glances, knowing they had witnessed something extraordinary, and the next second would mark the first human contact after a battle fought in silence. Hayes extended her hand, the pilot grasping it firmly, a moment of silent acknowledgement, the SEALs circling to provide security, yet their eyes on the woman who had guided a wounded machine through impossible odds, and she could feel the tension in the ridge beginning to ease a little as reality settled, and the SEALs breathing slowly, adjusting to the sudden calm. But the ridge still carried the memory of screams, engines groaning, sparks, and smoke, and the next moments would reveal how deeply the ordeal had affected them. Ulf pilot lowered herself fully from the cockpit, boots touching the uneven ground, the fuselage creaking beneath its own weight. Hayes watched every movement, noting the fatigue etched into every muscle. The SEALs stepped closer, moving in synchronized silence, knowing that the aircraft still demanded respect, and she could see the subtle shifts the pilot made to ensure nothing shifted catastrophically, and the ridge seemed to hold its breath with them, the next steps critical to preserve both machine and life. Leaving suspense quietly simmering, a sudden hiss came from the engine compartment, a reminder that the aircraft was still alive and dangerous. Hayes signaled the SEALs to maintain distance while they assessed the situation, the pilot taking careful steps toward solid ground, every motion deliberate and measured. The SEALs followed her lead, eyes scanning the ridge and landing zone, knowing that one misstep could undo hours of struggle, and the next seconds would test their coordination and nerve. Leaving anticipation, Tauth pilot paused, taking a deep breath. Looking up toward the ridge where the SEALs had been watching every movement, their binoculars still trained on her, Hayes felt the weight of unspoken communication passing between soldier and pilot, a silent acknowledgement of endurance, courage, and human will, and the SEALs remained frozen, sensing the moment's gravity, knowing that the ridge had become a witness to a feat few could comprehend, and the next instant would fully reveal the bond forged in the struggle, leaving tension suspended. Landing strip trembled faintly as the A-10's systems cooled, the metal contracting with small groans. Hayes stepped closer, cautious yet determined, offering guidance to the pilot, the SEALs moving in a protective circle around the aircraft, their eyes constantly scanning the valley beyond, and she could see the muscles in the pilot's jaw tightening with concentration, every step a negotiation with gravity-damaged systems, and sheer fatigue in the next moments would determine if both machine and pilot remained intact, leaving suspense heavy in the air. The pilot nodded slightly, signaling readiness to move fully to secure the aircraft. Hayes stepped forward, guiding her toward the SEALs. They moved slowly as a unit, boots crunching against the rocky terrain, the fuselage still smoking faintly, engines humming low, and the SEALs exhaled slowly, sensing the first measure of relief, but the ridge still carried tension in every shadow, every spark, every lingering wisp of smoke, and the next moments could reveal hidden dangers left behind by the flight, leaving nerves taut. A gust of wind swept down the ridge, shaking loose small stones. Hayes instinctively ducked slightly, the SEALs flinching in unison, the pilot adjusting her footing carefully, metal groaning under stress, and Hayes felt the pulse of the aircraft through the ridge, a reminder that survival had not yet ended. The SEALs mirrored her awareness, every sense sharpened, every breath measured, and the next instant could reveal whether the landing strip would finally hold without incident. Leaving suspense persistent, SEALs moved closer in formation, creating a protective arc around the pilot and the aircraft, Hayes signaling slowly, every gesture deliberate and clear, the pilot moving carefully toward solid ground, each step measured to avoid twisting the damaged landing gear, and the ridge seemed to breathe with them, every small vibration from the fuselage echoing through rocks and air, and the next moments could determine whether the fragile equilibrium would finally stabilize, leaving tension taut and continuous. Aircraft settled slightly as the pilot reached a more secure position. Hayes breathed slowly, sensing the first real measure of calm. The SEALs exhaling quietly, their muscles relaxing a fraction, knowing that the worst might be over, but the ridge still whispered of danger in every creaking panel, every spark that had not yet faded, and the next seconds would test patience, endurance, and careful coordination, leaving suspense hovering like smoke over the valley. The pilot crouched, briefly checking the landing gear and structural integrity, Hayes moving closer to provide guidance, the SEALs maintaining positions, scanning every direction, the sun reflecting off torn panels, casting fleeting glimmers across the ridge, and she could feel the tension ebb and flow with each careful movement, every step a negotiation with physics, fatigue, and exhaustion, and the next moments would determine if the A-10 would remain upright or if disaster would strike at the last second. Leaving suspense, Olivia, faint metallic groan came from the fuselage, a reminder of the strain, Hayes signaling the SEALs to stay alert, every motion deliberate. The pilot leaning into every adjustment, muscles taut, eyes focused yet weary, and the SEALs remained frozen, their breaths shallow, sensing the fragile balance between survival and catastrophe, the ridge alive with the echoes of engine sparks and tension, and the next moments would reveal whether the machine and its pilot had truly survived the impossible. Leaving suspense unbroken, the pilot finally stood fully upright, Hayes stepping beside her, guiding the way toward a more secure patch of terrain, the SEALs forming a protective circle around them, eyes scanning the horizon, and she could see the relief beginning to show in the pilot's posture, every muscle still taut, yet a flicker of triumph in her expression, and the ridge seemed To exhale with them, the danger passed, but the memory of battle etched into every rock shadow, and the next seconds would mark the first step toward recovery, leaving suspense lingering. The SEALs and pilot moved together, slowly securing the A-10 carefully. Every step measured, Hayes leading, while the SEALs scanned and observed the fragile ridge and surrounding valley, and she could feel the pulse of survival in every motion, the aircraft still smoking slightly but intact, and the SEALs exhaled quietly, sensing the first real sign that the impossible had been achieved. But the next moments would test endurance, vigilance, and care, leaving tension quietly simmering. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the ridge and landing strip. The pilot finally safe beside the SEALs, Hayes looking at the damaged aircraft, the torn panels, engines, quieting the smoke drifting lazily into the sky, and the SEALs shared a silent acknowledgement of the feat they had witnessed, the courage, skill, and endurance required to coax a wounded machine through impossible odds, and the ridge stood as a witness to human will, leaving suspense transformed into awe.